The bourbon hit the bottom of the crystal tumbler with a dull thud, splashing amber liquid across a stack of architectural blueprints spread haphazardly on Thaddius Kiteon's mahogany desk. Outside, Boston lay smothered in white, the kind of snow that softened sound and made everything look more beautiful than it was. Inside, the study was all sharp edges and shadows. Thaddius's jaw twitched as he stared past the frost-laced windows, his knuckles whitening around the glass. "Say it again," he said, voice low. Dangerous. Eloin stood a few feet away, near the fireplace where the flames threw gold light across her pale face. She looked like a painting out of place in a museum of still delicate, but not weak. Her hands rested on her stomach, the slightest of curves beneath the silk of her blouse. She had come into the room prepared to share a miracle. Now she braced herself against the storm. "I'm pregnant," she said, more gently this time. "Thaddius, we're going to have a baby." His laugh was sharp and cruel, echoing loud in the room. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, we're not. You're pregnant. I'm sterile." "That's not true," she whispered, stepping closer. "You've seen the same doctors I have. They said it would be difficult, not impossible. They said I was medically incapable." He snapped, slamming the tumbler down. Liquid sloshed over the edge, staining the plans for a tower he'd just closed a deal to build in Singapore. "You expect me to believe this child is mine? What do you take me for?" "For your wife," she said, barely above a whisper. "For someone who's loved you faithfully for 5 years." Thaddius turned slowly to face her, the fury in his eyes wasn't born only a betrayal, it was fear. Insecurity buried deep beneath layers of power and polish. "My mother warned me about you," he said, almost to himself. "Said you were after my fortune. The minute she died, I should have." Eloin's hand trembled where it rested on her abdomen, but she didn't flinch. "Don't you dare bring her into this. I'd have never once given you reason to doubt me. Never. And this baby, this miracle should be everything we hoped for. But instead, I don't believe in miracles." He cut in coldly. "I believe in evidence. And this," he gestured wildly toward her stomach, "this is not mine." He turned to the wall behind the desk, where an original Monet hung discreetly, spinning the dial of the safe hidden behind it with mechanical precision. He pulled out a black leather checkbook and wrote with a hand so tense the pen nearly tore through the paper. The check landed on the desk between them with a snap. "Take it," he said, "and disappear. Consider it severance for services rendered." Eloin stared at it, unmoving. The number was staggering enough to vanish, to live in quiet luxury somewhere far from the judgment in his eyes. But she didn't reach for it. Instead, she looked at him as if truly seeing him for the first time. "You think you can pay me off like a contractor on your payroll? This isn't a business transaction, Thaddius. This is your child, not mine," he said flatly. "And if you try to contact me, try to make any claims, my lawyers will bury you." A long silence hung between them, broken only by the tick of the grandfather clock and the soft howl of the wind beyond the windows. Eloin stepped forward, picked up the check, tore it cleanly down the center, and then again before letting the pieces fall into the wastebasket beside the desk. "I don't want your money," she said. "I want the man I married, but he's gone. Maybe he never existed." She turned to go. "You'll be out by morning," he said behind her. Eloin paused in the doorway, hand on the knob. Her voice was steady, crystalline. "By morning," she said. "But when this child is born, it won't be the beginning of shame. It'll be the beginning of something beautiful, and you'll still be alone, with your towers and your cold hands and your hollow victories." The door closed. With a quiet click, she walked out into the snow. No coat, no luggage, just a small handbag and the faint warmth of life stirring within her. On the curb, as the flakes fell heavier, she pressed a hand to her stomach and whispered into the night, "We're going to be okay. I promise you that." And behind her, in the mansion made of stone and silence, Thaddius Kiteon poured himself another drink and told himself the tightness in his chest was nothing but rage. The bus terminal smelled like coffee gone cold and old lives waiting to be discarded. South Station pulsed with the comings and goings of people with places to be. Eloin had none. Snowflakes clung to her lashes as she stood just inside the terminal doors, her small suitcase at her feet, her phone screen dimming in her palm. The balance in her account blinked back at her. $20.13. She exhaled slowly, watching her breath fog in the stale winter air. The ticket clerk didn't even glance up as he recited the cost to Chicago. $127.50. Eloine's heart dropped, but she nodded, as though she had the money, as though she were still the woman who once hosted charity galas in ballrooms dressed in crystal. Now she stood in thrift store boots that didn't quite fit, clutching a suitcase stuffed with memories of a life she was no longer part of. Next, the clerk called out. She stepped aside, eyes scanning the crowd. I can't stay here. Boston felt like a cage. Thaddius's ghost prowled every glass tower and marble lobby. If she stayed, he'd make good on his threat. She'd seen the gleam in his eyes, not rage, strategy, the kind of cold calculation he used in boardrooms before swallowing a rival whole. She paced the terminal with practiced poise, stopping before strangers with the kind of desperate dignity only the truly abandoned understand. Excuse me, she began. Some would pretend not to hear. Others offered curt apologies. The worst were the ones who looked her up and down, like she was a con artist playing a long game, her stomach twisted with hunger. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Her last meal had been a cup of broth in the Kiteon mansion, left half finished when she decided tonight was the night to tell him about the baby, her miracle. She was beginning to believe in it less and less. Miss? A voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. She turned toward a stooped man with weathered skin and a cap that had once been red, but now looked rusted. His eyes were kind in a way that made her throat tighten. I need to get to Chicago, she managed, shame coating her tongue. I'm not asking for money. I have nowhere to go here. He studied her, not with suspicion but with recognition. I was homeless once, he said, back in '87. Lost everything in a fire. Some woman in Detroit gave me a bus ticket. No reason, just said, pay it forward. He pulled out a tattered wallet and slid out the exact fare. Eloine opened her mouth, but no words came. She gripped the money like a lifeline. That baby deserves a chance, he said, as if he could see straight through to the life she carried inside. She cried then, quietly, not the desperate sobs of drama, but the small, clean kind of tears that come with being seen. The bus to Chicago left at midnight. As it pulled away from the terminal, Eloine pressed her forehead to the cool window, watching Boston dissolve into snow and distance. Her body ached from exhaustion, and yet, somewhere, in the ache, hope was buried like a hot coal. She didn't sleep. Not really, just drifted, dreamed of being somewhere warm, dreamed of a crib in a corner of a room filled with borrowed furniture, dreamed of a tiny voice saying, Mama. When the bus rolled into Chicago's Lincoln Park 18 hours later, the sun was setting behind the buildings like fire bleeding into the sky. She hadn't called ahead, didn't know if Margaret even still lived in the same apartment, but she had no other name, no other door to knock on. She stood at the threshold for a long time before raising her hand to knock. The door opened quicker than expected. Margaret's face froze. Eloine. Tears welled before Eloine could speak. I didn't know where else to go, she whispered. Margaret didn't ask questions. She pulled her inside with arms that still smelled like vanilla and chalkboard dust. Jesus, she said. You're freezing. Sit. I'll make tea. In the warmth of that small apartment, beneath the tapestry of string lights and stacked books, Eloine told the truth. Not just the surface wounds, Thaddius's accusations, the thrown check, the cruel exile, but the deep ones, the parts where she admitted she was scared, lost, and barely holding on. Margaret listened, not with pity, but with fury. That bastard, she said, he'll die with money and no soul. Eloine stared into the tea Margaret had made, hands trembling. I don't know how to start over. Margaret reached across the table. You don't have to know. You just have to begin. That night, Eloine curled on a borrowed couch with borrowed blankets and whispered to her stomach, we're not broken, just cracked. Cracks let the light in, but the cracks would deepen before they heal. Because 2 weeks later, Margaret's landlord raised the rent, and a fire in the adjacent unit left the building without heat for nights, because the diner where Eloine applied didn't want to hire a pregnant woman with no work history, because she began spotting one afternoon in the shower and ended up in a free clinic with fluorescent lights that buzzed like a wasp hive. You need rest, the nurse said, adjusting the fetal monitor. Stress isn't good for the baby. But rest was a luxury Eloine couldn't afford. Still, in the shadows, a thread began to weave through the chaos. A woman named Nancy from a diner called Sullivan's gave her a chance. You mess up, I fire you. You work hard, I keep you. That's simple, she said. It wasn't kindness. It was fairness. And fairness was more precious than gold in a world that had shown her neither die, so Eloin worked. Morning to night, tips into a jar labeled baby fund. She studied medical admin courses at night, her swollen ankles aching, her back knotted in pain, and through it all, the baby kicked, like he knew she needed the reminder. He was coming, ready or not, and she would be ready, even if the world wasn't. The first time Callum opened his eyes, Eloin saw everything she had fought for reflected in them and everything she feared. They were sharp, impossibly blue, cold like polished steel. His eyes, Thaddius's eyes, for the briefest moment, it rattled her. But then he let out a cry full of life and fury, and she knew those eyes would never look at the world the way his father had, not if she had anything to do with it. They named him Callum Bennett, discarding the Kiteon name like a coat she'd never agreed to wear. At the county hospital, where half the nurses knew Nancy from Sullivan's Diner, no one asked where the father was. Margaret brought peanut butter cookies and a stuffed elephant. Nancy grumbled that Callum looked like a troublemaker already, but secretly slipped Eloin a check that covered a month of diapers and formula. Back in their tiny Chicago apartment, the living room became nursery, dining space, and office. They hung a yard sale mobile above the crib stars sewn by Margaret. After school and tacked cardboard alphabets on the walls. On the fridge, next to Callum's hospital photo, Eloin taped a typed-out note. Every day forward is a step farther from him, and closer to the life you choose. She lived by it. She had to. By the time Callum was 4, he was obsessed with blocks and buildings. Not the typical kind, but elaborate towers he built from couch cushions and soup cans. Drawing windows with a Sharpie and saying things like, "This one touches the clouds." He's an architect, Margaret declared one afternoon, sipping tea on the couch while watching Callum balance a cereal box on a stack of encyclopedias. He's curious, Eloin said cautiously, though she felt it too this strange magnetic pull toward structure, design, balance, the things Thaddius once worshipped. Still, she never spoke his name, not out of hatred, but survival. To her, Thaddius was a ruin best left unexcavated, but silence, it turns out, has its own kind of echo. At 6 years old, Callum came home from school with a drawing clutched in his tiny hand. It was of a family, Eloin with curly brown hair, Callum in a red shirt and a blank space where the father should have been. "We had to draw our families," he said quietly, slipping into her lap. "Tommy said everyone has a dad. Do I?" It hit like a punch. Not just the question, but the look in his eyes. Not confusion, not sadness, just longing. Eloin brushed his hair back and chose her words like a surgeon choosing where to cut. "Yes," she said, "everyone has a father. Yours lives far away." "Did he die?" Callum asked, with the honesty only children have. She paused. Her instinct screamed protect him. But truth had its place too. "No, honey, he's alive. But when you were in my tummy, we couldn't agree about what life should look like. So we built separate lives. Did he know about me?" A whisper now. A beat passed before she answered. "He did. He just couldn't understand what a gift you are." Callum blinked slowly, processing this in the silent way of the deeply thoughtful. "I'd still like to meet him someday," he said after a while, and Eloin's heart cracked. Because how could she tell him that the man who built cities had refused to build a family? That night, after Callum had fallen asleep under a blanket of storybooks and moonlight, Eloin stood in the kitchen and stared at the fridge. Her fingers trembled as she reached up and tore the quote down. Every day forward wasn't just a step away from Thaddius. It was a step toward him too. Because the past wasn't done with them. It was circling, years past. Callum grew into a gentle boy with a mind like a blueprint. He could sketch floor plans from memory and once rebuilt a Lego model of the Eiffel Tower, based only on a photo he glimpsed in a magazine. People noticed. A teacher submitted his drawings to an architecture summer camp. A local news article featured him as a young mind shaping tomorrow's skylines. Donations followed, small scholarships, community support. Pride swelled in Eloin's chest like a wave. And yet, beneath the joy, an old anxiety grew because one of the buildings Callum admired most idolized. Even was a glass and steel monolith called the Cratton Meridian, constructed in Boston. "It looks like it floats," he said once, dreamily, like a dream someone made real. Eloin said nothing, her fingers clenching the teacup so tightly she thought it might crack. Callum was 10 when the first letter came, A white envelope with a Boston return address. No name, no markings. Inside, a news clipping, Thaddius Kiteon Forbes. Feature, The Empire of Glass. There was no message, no note, just the article. A profile of success, no mention of family, no mention of Callum. As if they'd never existed, Aloy burned the clipping in the sink. She never told Callum, but someone had found them, and someone wanted her to know it. That night, when she tucked her son into bed, he looked up at her with eyes that had once belonged to a stranger and said, "Do you think people can change, Mama?" "Sometimes," she said, her voice steady, but not always for the better. Outside, the wind howled. Snow began to fall in Chicago, and far away in a Boston penthouse. Thaddius Kiteon stared at an untouched glass of scotch and whispered into the empty room, "I should have looked for them," but the silence didn't answer. It never had. Callum always walked faster in New York. The city seemed to demand it, as if it were testing who could keep up and who it could leave behind. He didn't mind. The rhythm suited him, purposeful, unrelenting. Most days, he crossed the Columbia campus with a sketchbook under one arm and headphones tucked in, but silent. He preferred to listen to the world. Steel groaning, cab swearing, footsteps in sync with ambition. Architecture suited him, too. Buildings told the truth, even when people did in single quotes. It was early October, and the air tasted like copper and rain. The city was caught in that in-between moment, still holding summer's ghost, but with winter's shadow in its bones. That afternoon, Callum and his roommate Tyler were wandering through lower Manhattan after class, debating whether to grab ramen or dollar pizza. Callum wasn't really listening. His eyes kept scanning upward, always upward, and then he saw it. A glass tower, impossibly tall, disturbingly familiar, stood like a blade slicing the skyline. Sleek, modern, cold. Kiteon Financial Center, etched in stainless steel above the doors. Callum stopped breathing. Tyler followed his gaze. "You good, man?" But Callum couldn't speak. He stared at the building the way one stares at a ghost that doesn't know it's dead. "Looks like a damn spaceship," Tyler said, whizzing. "I think your brain just left the planet." "Who designed it?" Callum asked quietly. Tyler blinked. "Seriously, Kiteon, dude's a legend. Real estate mogul, legacy builder, Forbes cover model Weiss. Built half of Boston, a third of Singapore, and I think he's got a hand in that mega tower in Dubai." Callum stared harder. "Thaddius Kiteon, yeah. You know the name." Callum didn't answer. He just kept looking, because now that he'd seen it, he couldn't unsee it. The symmetry, the precision, the audacity of it. This wasn't just a building, it was a statement, and every line of it felt disturbingly familiar, like it came from somewhere deep inside him. That night, back in the dorm, Callum couldn't sleep. The building haunted him. He scrolled through article after article, profile after profile. Thaddius Kiteon, the sterile titan of glass, the solitary genius, the brilliant recluse. No mention of a wife, no mention of a child, just wealth, power, control. And photos, dozens of them. In one, Thaddius stood with arms folded in front of a scale model, looking down at it like a god admiring his own creation. Callum stared at the photo for a long time. The eyes, the jawline, the hands, they were his. "You're the best thing he never deserved," his mother once said, years ago, when she thought he was asleep. But what if she had been wrong? What if Thaddius hadn't just let go? What if he had erased them? The next morning, Callum skipped class and took the train downtown. He wasn't sure what he planned to do. Just see the building again, he told himself. Maybe walk past the lobby, feel something shift. But as the train rattled beneath the city, something inside him solidified. A decision formed like steel being poured. At 10:40 a.m., he stood in the marble lobby of Kiteon Financial Center. It was colder inside than he expected, sterile, echoing, cathedral-like in its grandness. Art installations hovered in glass cubes. Security guards flanked polished walls. A receptionist sat behind a chrome desk like a gatekeeper in a suit. She looked up. "May I help you?" Callum stepped forward. "I need to speak with Thaddius." "Kiteon," her eyes flicked down to her screen. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." His voice was steady, but his heart was not. "But he'll want to see me." The woman raised an eyebrow. "And you are?" Callum hesitated. Then, "I'm his son." The pause that followed wasn't just awkward, it was seismic. The room seemed to tilt. Her fingers froze above the keyboard. "I'll see if he's available. Please wait." Callum sat in one of the sleek leather chairs and tried not to let the adrenaline show in his posture, but his fingers trembled against his knee. Behind him, the elevator chimed. Somewhere above, Thaddius Kiteon's world spun in quiet, cruel circles. The receptionist returned 10 minutes later, her expression unreadable. Mr. Kiteon will see you now. She motioned to a suited security guard who gestured toward a private elevator. Callum stood, forcing his knees to work. The ascent was silent. 30-7 floors later, the elevator doors opened to a floor blanketed in light and power. There was no clutter, no warmth, just clean lines and quiet wealth. At the end of the hall, behind a desk the size of a sailboat, Thaddius Kiteon stood waiting. The resemblance was unbearable. Callum stepped forward. One word, heavy with history, bloomed between them. Hello, he said. Thaddius stared. You're not a hallucination, he said finally. Callum gave a hollow laugh. No, but I've had enough of those. You look like her, Thaddius said, voice low, but the eyes, those are mine. He crossed the room like a man walking toward his own past. He stopped a few feet away. You're Callum, you knew. I suspected, Thaddius said, but I didn't act on it. Not until now. Callum's jaw clenched. Why now? Thaddius looked tired, not physically but in the soul, because now, I have nothing left to protect. You think I want money? Callum snapped. No. Thaddius said simply, I think you want the truth, the air between. Them shimmered like heat off pavement, and for the first time in 19 years, father and son stood face to face, not as strangers, but as reflections neither could fully understand. What came next would change both of them forever. The skyline didn't mourn. When giants fall, the world doesn't tremble. It keeps moving, unaware that one of its architects is crumbling from the inside out. For weeks after their confrontation, Callum told no one, not Tyler, not his professors, not his mother, especially not his mother. He carried the meeting like a burning stone in his chest, something that warmed and hurt at the same time. Thaddius Kiteon had not denied him, but he hadn't embraced him either. It had been an exchange of truths, dry and clinical, DNA acknowledged, in a sentence, not a gesture, regret hinted at, but never offered. A man to use to silence, trying to forge connection with tools he didn't understand. Callum had left that glass tower with shaking hands and acid in his throat. That night, he sat in the shadows of his dorm room and stared at the glowing photo of a skyscraper he used to admire. Now it looked like a mausoleum. He didn't contact Thaddius again, but fate had its own blueprints. 3 weeks later, Callum's phone rang. The number was unlisted. He let it ring. It rang again an hour later, and then a third time the next morning. Relentless, deliberate. He answered on the fourth call. Mr. Bennett. The voice on the other end was female. Control. This is Evelyn Norwood. I'm Mr. Kiteon's personal counsel. Callum sat up, already bracing. Mr. Kiteon has requested your presence. It's urgent. He said nothing. He's very ill, the woman added quietly. There's not much time. The words hit harder than expected. What kind of ill? Stage for pancreatic cancer. He was diagnosed 6 weeks ago. He's refusing treatment. He's preparing his affairs. Callum's thoughts swirl, not in sympathy, but in calculation, regret, curiosity, maybe even dread. The next day, at precisely 3 p.m., he was back inside the Kiteon building. This time, there were no sweeping gazes, no security formalities. Evelyn met him in the lobby. She was tall, elegant, with an expression honed by years of managing power like a scalpel. Thank you for coming, she said. He won't admit it, but he needs this. Why now? Callum asked as the elevator rose. She sighed. Because empires make poor company when you're dying. The elevator opened to the penthouse suite. Not the office, not the fortress, but the place Thaddius called home. It didn't feel like one. The apartment was pristine, but joyless. High ceilings, minimal furniture, art on the walls that seemed chosen by committee. Callum had seen hotel rooms with more soul. The only sign of life was a chessboard by the window, a game halfway played and abandoned. Thaddius was seated on a leather chaise, thinner than before. The power had bled from his posture. His once imposing frame now resembled a monument after a storm, dignified but weathered. He looked up. Callum, you look like hell, Callum said. Thaddius cracked a faint smile. Good, that means I'm not pretending. Silence stretched between them like wire. You're dying, Callum said bluntly. Yes. He gestured to the chair across from him. Please. Callum didn't move. Why am I here? Thaddius met his gaze. His voice, when it came, had none of the corporate varnish. Because I don't want to die a stranger to my only son. The word son hung in the air like an unresolved chord. You gave that title up before I was born, Callum said, but this time his voice didn't have the anger he'd rehearsed for years. It just held weight. I know. Thaddius closed his eyes for a moment, as if steadying himself against memory. You think I didn't wonder? That I didn't wake up in the middle of the night with your name on my tongue and shame in my chest? You didn't look for us. I did. He admitted. Once. When you were 10. I sent a letter. It came back unopened. Your mother made sure I stayed buried. Callum clenched his fists. She protected me. From what? Thaddius asked, tone sharpening. A man who was too afraid of being wrong. A man who was wrong. Callum snapped. A man who let pride decide my life before I ever took my first breath. Thaddeus's hand trembled. He reached for a water glass but spilled it halfway. Evelyn entered silently and cleaned it up without comment. She left just as quietly. Callum watched the exchange. It disturbed him how fragile the man looked. How human. How long? He asked finally. A few months. Thaddius said, maybe less. What do you want from me? Conversation. Thaddius said, not forgiveness, not absolution. I've made peace with what I am. You sure about that? Thaddius chuckled dryly. Not really. Callum looked away. Out the window, the city churned. A city Thaddius helped shape. A city that didn't know its architect was vanishing one cell at a time. Thaddius leaned forward with surprising strength. Let me give you something before I go. I don't want your money. I'm not offering it. Thaddius said, I'm offering answers. I want to tell you the truth. About me. About your mother. About why I destroyed the only thing that ever made me feel real. Callum stared at him. Suspicion warring with something else. A need he didn't want to name. Outcome Mondays. He said after a beat. That's all I can promise. That's more than I deserve. Thaddius said as Callum turned to leave. Thaddius added quietly. Does your mother know you're here? Callum paused at the door. No. He said. Not yet. Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing. Through the corridor of a dying empire died behind him, Thaddius Kiteon sat alone in the silence. The last tycoon in a tower of glass, trying to rewrite the story before the final page turned to ash. The grave was newer than the others. The marble still pale, the earth still uneven. No grand mausoleum or gaudy sculpture marked the spot, just a headstone carved with simple elegance. Eloine Marie Bennett, beloved mother, fierce soul, quiet storm. 1976 to 2017, the cemetery overlooked Boston Harbor, where the skyline she once fled now shimmered under autumn haze. Boats moved like distant thoughts across the water. Callum stood in front of her grave with his hands in his pockets and sorrow in his spine. He hadn't cried at the funeral. Not when Margaret folded the letter Eloine had written to him in case she passed. Not when Nancy gripped his shoulder in that uncharacteristic silence that meant everything. Not when the nurse handed him the envelope with his mother's effects, her locket, her work ID, a folded sonogram still tucked inside her wallet. But now at 19, in the city of his blood, he stood at her resting place and wept like a child. I saw him, Mom, he whispered, voice trembling. I saw Thaddius. The name still felt foreign on his tongue. He had never dared say it aloud when she was alive, not because she forbade it, but because he knew instinctively that naming him gave him power. I asked him why. Callum continued. Why he left. Why he never looked. He didn't have answers, not real ones, just ghosts. A breeze stirred the leaves. He imagined it was her voice, somehow. The kind of soft hush she used to use when he had nightmares. I kept waiting to hate him, he confessed. But when I looked in his eyes, all I saw was emptiness. Like he built towers so no one could see how hollow he is inside. He knelt and placed a hand on the stone. But you gave me everything, without money, without help. You built me, Mom, and that matters more than anything he ever constructed. Footsteps crunched in the grass behind him. Callum tensed, his grief slicing into alertness. He turned slowly. An older man stood a few yards away. He wore a dark wool coat and held his hat respectfully in his hands. His eyes were red-rimmed, his mouth hesitant. I'm sorry to interrupt, the man said softly. I didn't mean to intrude. Callum stood, Do you know her? I did once, the man said. Long ago. I'm her father. The words didn't register at first. Not fully. My name is Graham Bennett. I live in Shropshire, England. He faltered, emotion catching in his throat. I never knew about you, or her life here. Not until a lawyer contacted me after Thaddius passed. Callum's breath hitched. Thaddius sent someone. Graham nodded. A private investigator. He said my daughter had passed, and that I had a grandson. He left everything to you. Callum's knees nearly buckled. He didn't just leave money, Graham continued. He left letters. Dozens of them. Some addressed to you, some to her. They were never sent. Callum stared at the man who shared the same bone structure as his mother, the same quiet dignity. She thought you abandoned her. I know, Graham said, his voice heavy. I made mistakes. I was strict, cold, even, when she married Thaddius. We argued. I told her he wasn't a man who could love anyone more than himself. She left. We never spoke again. Callum let out a slow breath. History has a habit of repeating itself. I came to say goodbye, Graham said gently to her, and maybe, if you'd allow it, hello to you. The boy who had once been fatherless looked at the man who had once lost a daughter, and in that moment, they both understood what it meant to carry regret too long. Callum stepped forward and extended his hand. Graham took it. The handshake turned into an embrace, cautious, but real. They stood together in silence for a while, the wind carrying salt from the harbor. Afterward, Graham offered to drive him to the reading of the will. The law office was modern and unremarkable. Inside, Callum sat at a polished table with Evelyn Norwood and 3 legal assistants. Graham sat beside him, still absorbing the weight of decades missed. Evelyn opened a manila envelope. Per Mr. Kiteon's final testament, everything he owned, businesses, properties, patents, and personal effects are to be transferred to Mr. Callum Bennett. Callum blinked. Everything? She nodded. There is no other heir. He made that very clear. Did he explain why? Evelyn smiled faintly. In his final letter to you. She handed him a sealed envelope. The handwriting was elegant, rigid. Callum opened it slowly. Callum, I spent my life mistaking structure for strength, control, for wisdom. I built towers so no one could see the rubble inside me. You somehow grew from the ashes of my choices into something better than I deserved. This empire means nothing if I can't give it to someone who will build something real from it. Use it to give what I never could hope. Tell your mother I was wrong. Tell her I was afraid. You were never a mistake. You were the only thing I ever got close to doing right. Thaddius Kiteon folded the letter and slipped it into his pocket. He stood. There will be no empire, he said. Everyone looked up. I'm selling it. Every building, every piece of art. The foundations being converted into a trust scholarships for single parents, grants for underfunded architects, emergency housing for women in crisis. Evelyn blinked. Are you sure? It's a vast portfolio. I'm sure, Callum said. The world has enough towers. It needs bridges. Later that evening, he returned to his mother's grave. I think I understand now, he whispered. Why you never told me everything. Why you let me form my own truth. You knew this day would come. He knelt and placed his palm flat on the headstone. The past is buried now, but the future, he smiled through tears. The future is ours to build.